Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. Welcome back into the studio. We are going to be continuing with the thread we've been following recently, that be last week, and that thread is casting. Today, however, we are not casting in the traditional sense. We will be connecting the torso to the legs on my Empyrean sculpture. The sculpture is cast in hydro resin, also known as aqua resin, and there's several other different brand names out there. And there are already 2 videos out on the channel detailing the process that I went through to cast these 2 pieces. But when the top and the bottom are cast individually, which is the easiest way to do it, you must connect them somehow to get a whole sculpture again. And to do that, we will be using a technique that Mari Brady, a former fellow student and now fellow instructor at the Florence Academy of Art, taught me back in 2017 when she helped me cast the Dereliction of Self for Mayam's Figurativas exhibition. All things considered, the technique is fairly straightforward. One of the 2 pieces that are going to be attached to each other get long pieces of fiberglass attached to it. On the inside, of course, so it's not ruining the look of the sculpture. The fiberglass is attached using the same resin that the sculpture is originally made out of. This can be done with a large amount of time in between when the original cast was created and when this process takes place, as this aqua resin, hydro resin material, unlike plaster, will almost always have an easy time bonding or sticking to itself, no matter what. These pieces of fiberglass are attached, but only half of the piece of fiber gets resin. That's the half that's inside the torso in this case, so that it sticks inside the torso. The other half is left hanging outside the torso and is left alone for now, essentially left dry. For ease of use, it's best to keep the resin from getting too close to the bottom edge where the legs will eventually meet the torso. If resin gets on this part, the fiber becomes a lot stiffer and difficult to maneuver and might not stay as flexible. And you'll see that we want the fiber to be fairly flexible in order for this to go according to plan. I chose to attach the fiber to the torso in this case because we want gravity to help us, and the torso is on top of the legs obviously, so the fiber will hang down and fall down into the legs once we get to that part. Imagine if this was done in the opposite way. There would be no way for the fiberglass to reach upwards and attach itself to the inside of the torso. But with the pieces attached to the inside of the torso, they will fall down on the inside of the legs and attach. The cast pieces you are working with dictates how well this process is going to go for you. The inside section of the legs, in my case here, are on an incline on a positive angle, so I know that gravity will force these fiberglass pieces to lay down and touch them. Depending on the inside of the cast piece on the legs, gravity might not be able to help me, and then this technique is really not that useful. If the fiber can't touch anything on the other piece, it won't stick, obviously. You could of course create some sort of lump or bump on the inside of the leg using fiberglass to build it up. That would potentially help with the connection if the angle inside the legs isn't exactly right. But in my case it's not needed, as all the pieces of fiberglass will have something to lay down on. And so if I can get them on the inside of the legs when I put the torso on top, and if the fiberglass pieces don't get all knotted up, I should be good. Let's thank today's sponsors, my Patreon supporters on Patreon, who have ensured the continued existence of this channel and allowed me to upgrade my gear bit by bit, making better looking and better sounding content for all of you watching. If you're interested in supporting the channel, or perhaps interested in getting feedback on your sculptures from me, then Patreon is the place for you. You can get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. And again, thank you to all my patrons who have given generously and supported me. It really means the world. Notice how I fold pieces out of the way in order to make sure I don't get resin all over them. The top piece, that's the one on the inside of the belly, will be folded over and lay on top of the belly in the same way, and this combats gravity nicely, so I don't have to struggle and fight to keep it from falling down on the inside of the belly, where it's supposed to be attached. Depending on the thickness of your resin mix and the type of fiberglass you are using, you might find that sometimes the fiber has a hard time sticking to the original cast, especially while combating gravity. Essentially meaning while it's upside down. With a slightly thicker mix, however, this is less of an issue as the mix itself becomes quite sticky. With 4 pieces attached, I now need to wait for the resin to properly set up. I let it sit for a few hours just to be really sure it all gets set up really well. In the meantime, I can fill some gaps in the seam on the torso and clean up the casting a bit. It's always good to find something to do while material is setting up, whether that be working in another area on another section or cleaning up after yourself. It's better to do a little bit of work here than take a nap. With the resin set, it's time to begin the attachment process. The dry fiber hanging outside the torso now becomes drenched in resin on both sides. The more resin here the better, as it will weigh down the fiber, forcing it to touch down on the inside surface of the legs. In order to further help with the connection, the inside of the legs also get covered in a generous layer of fresh resin, so that there's resin both on the inside of the legs and on the dry, or formerly dry, fiber hanging out from the inside of the torso. This increases the chances that the two will stick together. Let's take a quick second to talk about my Patreon page. On there you'll find exclusive Patreon content, videos that you will only have access to if you are my supporter on Patreon. The first series we have embarked on is the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture. We will cover how to sculpt a standing nude female figure in contrapposto in half-life size scale, and I will cover everything you need to know, from the armature, the sculpting, and eventually the mold making. This will be your one-stop for all the answers you'll need for sculpting a standing nude figure. Whether you sculpt from life or from photo reference, we will cover how to work from both. One video will be released on the first Thursday of every month. The video will be longer than you're used to seeing here on YouTube, around 30 to 45 minutes long, and it will be all real-time footage, no time lapses. And I will do my best to use a very linear process with clearly defined steps, making it both easy to follow and easy to do on your own. Any patron pledging $5 or more will get access to the videos. I'm excited to finally be putting out exclusive Patreon content to my patrons whose support is greatly appreciated. So check out my Patreon page by clicking the link in the description below. Resin can be a little bit messy and it's very hard and strong, and so switching to fresh gloves before lifting the torso in place ensures that no resin gets stuck on the castings that I'll then have to clean up later. Lucky for me, this material is very light and carrying the torso by myself is no problem. With a little gentle help, the resin-drenched fiber gets on the inside of the legs. Now I need to position the torso on top of the legs exactly as it needs to be, and it's fairly easy to do so as they register together almost perfectly. You just want to line them up as neatly as you can and make sure there's no areas that have huge or even small overlaps, so that when you fill the seam between the torso and the legs, which we'll do later, the transition will be smooth and invisible. Some loose fiber are coming out in the seam here a little bit, so I use a thin knife to push them back inside the legs. Otherwise it can be a little bit of a pain to get rid of them. While there's no requirement to fill the seam right now, I had extra resin on hand and thought there's no reason to waste good resin. So what I did was I put in a little bit more powder to thicken up the mix a little bit, and then I started filling in the seam. The seam is not too big, it's not too wide here, it's pretty small, and so filling it in with a thicker mix of resin is pretty straightforward. Because there is fiberglass all around on the inside of the seam, the resin has something to hit against. It's not just an open hole that the resin is going to fall down into. So this makes it a lot easier, and it further fills up that little bit of a gap between the fiber on the inside of the seam and the casting itself, further strengthening the connection. I use a metal spatula to smooth out the resin as I go along, and I make sure to go in passes several times around the sculpture. Essentially what this does for you is that if you missed a small spot on one pass, you'll hopefully catch it on the next pass, and you'll continually improve the work that you did on the last pass in the next one. It's important while doing this to not have large amounts of resin pile up in big lumps and bumps on the surface. You only want to do the job once, so too little is not good either, by the way. But too much resin becomes this massive headache that you need to remove later on. Resin becomes super hard and it's very tricky to deal with once it sets up. So I try to make sure I don't build up these huge blobs or globs that I'll then have to Dremel away later on. It's a lot harder as well to replicate the texture of the sculpture using a Dremel while you're removing. It tends to end up pretty smooth when you do it this way. And so replicating the texture of the piece is a lot easier when you do it in the resin while the resin is fresh. If you don't try to replicate the texture, you can end up with this awkward band of super smooth resin around the midsection of your sculpture, which can kind of look a little bit more glossy than the other areas, which will stand out. Remember, we want a seamless transition like this was cast in one piece, and I don't really want there to be any visible sign of the casting process. Now, some artists like Rodin actually left signs of the casting process on some of his plaster pieces, and I'm sure some of his bronze pieces as well. If you have a look at some of Rodin's plasters, you'll see these straight seam lines running through some of his pieces. So it's certainly the choice of the artist. Personally, I prefer a piece that doesn't have too much of my tool marks left on it. I like a cast to look just like the sculpture once did in clay, essentially. These techniques almost have to be adapted to the specific situation, and considering that every sculpture, every piece is somewhat different, you always have to stay on the ball of your feet and think through the problems you are attempting to solve before you attempt to solve them. And if you do it this way, I think you will be a lot more successful in your casting attempts. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did and want to learn sculpture from me or just support the channel, check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. And right now, there is exclusive sculpting content on my Patreon. The first series we have embarked on is the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture. I'm super excited to finally be creating exclusive content for Patreon, and I hope you will be too, and we'll take a look. The link to my Patreon is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.